I'm going to ask the number one question at the beginning of every Teams meeting. Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen.
All right. So thank you everybody for coming out tonight. The this is a topic that I was very hesitant to talk about when I was asked to do some research into it. And just a little bit of background story for me. I, like most .NET developers, tried to integrate our corporate identity into my application at some point in time and realized that any code that interacts with Active Directory is doomed to fail, and had some horrible experiences. Um, that scared me away from security, identity, authentication, authorization for a long time. And then one day, a project came up where we were doing a series of training, teaching people how to build end-to-end applications on Cosmos DB, Azure App Service, using a variety of programming languages and Docker containers. So I think like the front ends with JavaScript focus, back ends with .NET. We had a Java container, all sorts of fun stuff. The When building that, they said, well, we got to tell a real story around authentication. We can't just make everything anonymous. That's not realistic. And then as soon as somebody from enterprise look at this, they're going to say, well, I'm glad you wrote this training, Mr. Andrews, but nobody's ever going to put everything anonymous in the real world. So I started digging in, and I found out that there was a new identity platform from Microsoft that was designed with the sole purpose of making identity dev way easier for all of these developers across a variety of programming languages, not just .NET. And so I dug in. I pulled down the libraries, the Microsoft Authentication Library. I took a look at it. I loved it. And then I even dug deeper and I found that all of it was open source. So, for example, when I first really dug in, there were some of the methods and were synchronous when it could have been async, and some of the method names weren't consistent between different types of authentication methods. And so I went in and did a full rewrite of the inside library and PR'd it in. And the dev team worked with me over 2 weeks to give feedback. And I got to meet a lot of them virtually, never in person, just all virtually via GitHub. And we start emailing back and forth. And all of a sudden, all my changes were brought in, and then I became the subject matter expert on MSOW.net. So that's my crazy story of how I ended up really digging into this and stuff. And so one day, one of the guys on that team said, well, Sidney, you should share this with people. Like, now, the old way of using the library took 50 lines of code minimum to authenticate. Now the new way, maybe 3 or 4 lines. We should tell people that you can authenticate the Azure AD with 4 lines of code. People will listen. And I said, maybe. We did a video, posted on YouTube, got 20,000 views. It's like, oh wow. Oh, okay. People really hate it, writing authentication code, and they wanted something better. So that's today's talk. I'm going to talk to you about MSOW.net, the Microsoft Identity Platform. We're going to have a little bit of fun because we're going to not just talk about the library. I'm going to teach you some of the internals of how the Microsoft Identity Platform works. And then we're going to take that information. We're going to authenticate manually using Postman in a browser, no code at all, just to see the nuts and bolts of how authentication work. Then we're going to go in and we're going to use .NET in the Microsoft Authentication Library to do a manual authentication to just a URL. Then we'll use the Graph Library. And then if we got enough time at the end, I think I timed this just right, we will use the Azure service. I think I'm going to use Azure Storage tonight. And we're going to use all that same code to authenticate to Azure Storage. So really excited. I want to just jump in. I keep a couple slides around. I'm going to skip some slides because I really want to I put a lot more demos on here than I normally do. So I don't have as much time for slides, which is wonderful. So when I first talk to somebody about this, one of the things I talk about is that identity is really this control plane across all of our applications. The idea here is that we have these applications, whether we wrote them or somebody else wrote them, we have these devices and we have these people, and the only thing that ties them all together is their identity. You log in with your corporate account, whether you're logging into Office, whether you're logging into a device, a laptop, whether you're logging into a third-party service. When you interact with people, you use your identity to interact. When we send an email, we're essentially using, we're targeting someone else's identity and send a message to this person. So identity becomes this most important part of any application that interacts with the cloud, and it's the one that we like to dev against the least. And so Azure Active Directory is interesting because it's the worst name in the world. It's not Active Directory in the cloud. It's really just an identity service that supports a lot of modern standards and has tight integration with Active Directory. So the idea here is that we have this identity service, and many of us is already invested in it. If you're running Office 365, if you're running stuff in Azure, many times if your organization is just using the latest Windows devices, you already have some sort of investment in Azure AD. And so the idea here is that we already have an identity provider that's tied in to a lot of our organization with a lot of the information that we normally have to populate if we create our own identity platform or if we use a third party. So it's already there, but we as developers, we're kind of scared of writing code to it because the ADAL, the Active Directory Authentication Library, it was a mess. I remember distinctly the sample code, like the hello world for ADAL, was 250 lines of code. It was a mess. It and I know that people are like, well, you could probably did it in 50 lines. That's not that much better. It was just frustrating because there was so many little things you had to know, nuances to the library. There wasn't an easy, what I like to call a frictionless path to using this library. You had to have a lot of institutional knowledge to implement this library. So at some point, the Azure AD team said, well, we already have this service that people are kind of using by default, but we want more people to write code against this. We got to give a better API. It's the same story we tell with any service, which is if you want developers to dev, you have to write a good API. That API has to implement standards. That API has to be well documented. If you're having libraries, the library should be available in many different programming languages, and that wasn't the case for ADAL. So what they did is they took ADAL and they said, you know what? ADAL is version 1.0. Version 2.0 is the Microsoft Identity Platform. And I'm going to show you after this session is over, if you ever need to look up documentation for the Microsoft Identity Platform, you go to docs.com. That's the Microsoft documentation homepage. You select Azure. Then they have all the different Azure services you may be interested in. I'm going to go to Identity, and there's Azure Active Directory. And this is the landing page for Azure Active Directory. And from here, there's tons of documentation, tons of stuff that's interesting. But if I go to Microsoft Identity Platform and hit See More, it will take me to the landing page for the Microsoft Identity Platform. I'm going to pop this link in the chat for those who want it. The reality here is that the Microsoft Identity Platform is a rabbit hole. And not a rabbit hole because of complexity, a rabbit hole because it integrates with so many different things and it's pretty simple to use. So once you use it in one place, you're going to say, well, haven't I wanted to use this everywhere? And the other thing about the Microsoft Identity Platform is that you can leverage it yourself. So for example, if you are building your own application and you want to use the Microsoft Identity Platform to handle authentication between different service components, between the front end, back end of your application, for example, a user may log into the front of your application and you want to delegate those permissions so that the back end accesses the service on behalf of that user. All of this is done with the Microsoft Identity Platform. So the cool thing about this is essentially you have one pane of glass. You learn this library, it handles a lot of different situations. Now, the Microsoft Identity Platform really is just a version 2.0, a better API. They didn't say ADAL, oh, we're blowing it up and stuff like that. They are deprecating ADAL and they're telling you don't use it. But they just versioned that API and said, you sit in the corner and here's version 2.0. And version 2.0 has their own endpoint. It's just a REST API. Then that endpoint allows you to interact with organizational accounts, or otherwise known as work or school accounts. Personal accounts, that's like your Xbox, Microsoft account, stuff like that. And social accounts, like third-party accounts. So think Azure AD B2C. So the idea, again, one library, one pane of glass, depending on whatever identities you have stored in your Azure AD directory, whether they're organizational identities, third-party identities, Microsoft accounts, or social accounts, you have one library to access it all. And that's the Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL. MSAL comes in multiple flavors for different programming languages. A lot of the method names are the same. So one of the cool things about the MSAL is that if you learn in .NET, it's not difficult to learn a JavaScript version because a lot of the method names, a lot of the implementation is almost identical. So I just showed you the documentation. I'm moving a little faster than I'm used to. So I'm going to skip some of these slides, and all these are available online because I want to kind of get into code. So I'm going to show you how we register an application in Azure Active Directory so that we can use it with the Microsoft Identity Platform MSAL. So I have the Azure portal open in my browser, and I skipped some slides. And again, I apologize about that. I just have a lot of demos I want to show today. These slides usually assume not so many demos, right? I'm going to select Azure Active Directory. And down here, I'm going to go to app registrations. Now I'm going to create a new application registration. And an application registration is something that tells Azure AD that I'm going to be doing dev using Azure AD, and I need a set of credentials and permissions and all of that stuff encapsulated in a way that makes sense that I can use it for this one specific application. So I'm going to create a new application registration. I'm going to call this cat area net. Learn how to spell today. Now, supported account types. There's all sorts of types you can support. I can say, you know what, this is only going to work with organizational accounts within my organization. So my organization is C#run.net. So it'll only be people who have an alias within at C#run.net. That's a single tenant application. I can support multi-tenant, but only organizational accounts. That's that second option. It basically says anybody with an Azure AD account across any tenant, as long as it's an organizational or work or school account. The third option is organizational accounts plus personal Microsoft accounts. So support either organizational or personal Microsoft accounts. And then the fourth option is personal accounts only. Now, this is interesting because depending on what you select here, this influences the interface and the functionality that the person will see when they log in. You probably noticed this before. Like if you try to go to the Azure portal, you'll see a login experience that assumes you have a work or school account. Excuse me. But if you try to go to some of the other Microsoft sites, it may ask you, are you using a work or school account or a personal account? That's all that's influenced by what option is selected here. Even more so, how many times have you actually tried to log into your company stuff and it doesn't even ask you which account? It knows which tenant you're in. It shows your company background and the whole 9 yards. That's because they set up their application registration to assume it's a single tenant app, so that when you go to the login page, it doesn't have to wait for you to type in your email before showing you your corporate branding. It just shows corporate branding right away because only one organization's accounts are supported. So that's a pretty fun fact. And now that I said it, you're going to notice it every time you log into anything on Microsoft. You're going to, oh, that's multi-tenant. Oh, that's multi-tenant plus personal. Oh, this corporate one's single tenant because it goes straight to my company's background. So really, really, really cool stuff. Today, we're just going to do a multi-tenant app. And then for a redirect URI, if we're doing an application, we typically, especially for web applications, we send the user somewhere. They log in because our application isn't handling the login. That's happening in Azure in the browser, right? And then once they're logged in, we redirect them back. So here, I'm going to keep things simple. I'm going to say this is just a public client native application. So think mobile apps, desktop apps, console apps. And since it's a desktop app, HTTP localhost is going to work just fine. I can make this anything I want. Accept port numbers, all sorts of crazy stuff here, but we're just gonna keep things super simple today. I'm gonna hit register, and I now have an application. Now, I want to use this. And the way we log in, and remember I told you it's a REST API, is we use the login.microsoftonline.com URL, and we build a login experience using different endpoints for that URL. So today I have open Postman. And I have a couple slides we're going to show you to walk you through what we're going to do. So what we're going to do is what's called an interactive authentication flow. This is where you as a user application, you go to a browser, you go to Azure AD essentially, login.microsoftonline.com, you log in, it returns a code, and then that code is used to get a token, and that token is used as a bearer token to access whatever service you're going to use. For our first couple of demos, we're going to access the Microsoft Graph. If you're not familiar with the Microsoft Graph is essentially a REST API over everything in Microsoft, and it's not just data; it's AI, insights, activities, actions. So, for example, I can use the Microsoft Graph for simple stuff like pulling my profile data. I can use the Microsoft Graph to query all the Teams calls within my organization to see how many calls have been over 15 minutes. I can use the Microsoft Graph, and believe it or not, to actually influence Azure AD. Microsoft Graph is just an API for all things across Microsoft 365. So it's just a really, really cool thing that we could do a whole user group session just on the Microsoft Graph alone. But today I'm gonna just keep it simple. We're gonna just go to the graph and get my profile information. And that's the example we're gonna walk through today. So there's two things we need to do. We need to create a request to authorize. That means allow our user to log in. And we're gonna use OAuth 2.0. So essentially, we're going to go to login.microsoftonline.com. We're going to go to OAuth 2/2.0. So this is the 2.0 API and the authorize endpoint. We're going to send a GET request, and we need to provide a whole bunch of query string parameters to do that. And so I had this kind of pulled aside. I have my notes, make sure I always forget a parameter. So I always pull my notes up on the side to make sure I don't forget a parameter here. And again, all these slides, I'm skipping around them. They're available in a GitHub repo. Let me show you what this looks like, because I think looking at slides is not as interesting as seeing it firsthand. So HTTPS login.microsoftonline.com. By the way, the next time you log into Azure Portal, or you or one of your family members log into Xbox through the browser, you're going to realize, hey, it's always taking me to login.microsoftonline.com. You're welcome. You now know how that works. So after you go to login.microsoftonline.com, you have to pick a tenant. Now, if this is just a single tenant application, this is easy. I'll get my tenant GUID and paste that in. If this is a multi-tenant application, I can either infer a tenant by pasting in the GUID, or I can use some keywords that map to common tenant stuff. Like, for instance, there's the consumers keyword. That means any type of personal account. There's the organizations keyword. That means any type of organizational account. And then the common keyword, which means any organization or personal account. So for today's demos, we're going to just type in organizations to keep it simple. Now from there, I'm going to go to OAuth 2, which just says, hey, login.microsoftonline.com. We're going to use the OAuth 2 protocol. They support other protocols. And remember, I said Microsoft Identity Platform is the version 2.0, so V2.0. And anybody in the chat or via voice, if I need to zoom in on anything, let me know. It looks great from my end, but I don't know how things go over the internet. So if I need to zoom in, just feel free to let me know. And then we said we are going to go to the authorized endpoint. All right, so from the authorized endpoint, we need to put in some query string parameters. One of the beautiful things about Postman is if you don't want to type out all the syntax, you can just build the query string parameters in the GUI. So I can say client ID, and then paste in a value, ABCD, and it'll build out my query string here. Makes life a whole lot easier. So let's do that. We're going to go back to the Azure portal. We are going to grab my client ID from that application that we created. Jump right back into Postman. Not too worried, I'm going to delete this application registration as soon as we're done. So our client ID, paste that in. When we do this, I want to respond, use a response type with a code. And the response mode can be either form post, so send an HTTP post back, or a query string will send an HTTP get back. We'll do query string. That's pretty simple. The next thing I can do is say, hey, what my redirect URI is. This has to match the one I use in the application registration. So for this, I'll say HTTP localhost. And then the last thing is our scopes. Now, this is something I haven't talked about yet, but everything you do with our Azure AD application, you need to configure it in advance. You can't just decide, hey, I'm gonna create application registration and I'm gonna go access resources. You have to set up application permissions, scopes, use role-based access control in Azure, all the fun security stuff ahead of time. When you create your first application registration, if you go to API permissions, you'll see that you have access to Microsoft Graph API with the user.read scope. That's the only thing. So you can read your own profile. That's it. This is just in there by default, so you have something to test against. As you go further, you'll start adding in other services, including Microsoft Graph, different scopes, different permissions, all sorts of fun stuff. We're going to come back to this a little bit later. So for scopes, we have user.read. So let's go ahead and use that. Oh, wrong screen. User.read. And now I have a huge URL. I'm going to copy this URL, and copy it. And then I'm going to go into my browser and paste it. hit enter. It's gonna take, let's see, it says I need scope, not scopes. Check my notes. I think I put an S in scope. Did I? Yep. Look at that wonderful error message. You can tell developers built this. Normally you get an error message. Your request failed. Good luck. Hit enter. Okay. Now I was already logged in, so I don't see the login screen. But it says, okay, the Cap Area Net application is requesting permission to sign in and read your profile and maintain access to this profile information. I can, since I'm an administrator of my Azure AD tenant, I can consent for my entire organization so that we only see the screen once. Really great if you're using like a third-party SaaS app and you don't want every user to have to hit accept. Or I could just accept for myself. I'm going to just accept for myself today. So hit accept. And watch this. It's going to log in and it's going to redirect to localhost, just like we asked it to. It has a whole bunch of stuff on the query string. And if I try in the browser to parse this, it's going to be impossible. I'm going to show you a really cool trick you can do in Postman. Go back to Postman, go open a new screen. I'm going to paste the URL in, and it parses that URL for me. So here, it looks like I got a code back. So this is a code I received because I authorized successfully. And now I can use this code to go get a bearer token. So using HTTPS, login.microsoftonline.com/organizations/OAuth2 version 2.0. The base of the URL is the same, but instead of going to authorize endpoint, we're going to go to the token endpoint. This is where we go to convert our code that proved we authorized into a bearer token that has access to Azure service. So a couple things. It's going to request that our scope, actually this is a post, so I don't want to do query string parameters. I want to do form data in a body. So our scope has to match. User.read. Checking my notes. For the, we need to put in our client ID that needs to match. So I was moving fast, so I'll just go grab that client ID. We need to make sure our redirect URI matches, so that's HTTP localhost. And then we'll make sure we paste in that code that we got. So I'll just copy this code and paste it. And then the grant type. What do we want from this endpoint? Grant type. And for this, I want an authorization code. That's something I can actually send to Azure API using bearer token. So hit send. Hopefully I have no typos. And if I did it right, there's my bearer token. It's really long, but this is pretty cool. So I promised earlier that I'll show you the Microsoft Graph, aka.ms/ge. I'm going to put this link in the chat, aka.ms/ge. That takes us to the Microsoft Graph Explorer. It's, if you've never seen the Microsoft Graph before, this is the place to go. It teaches you how to interact with the graph, how to write code for the graph in different languages, and all the different things you can get. So the simplest thing, today we're not going to go deep into the graph, so I'm going to skip all that. But the simplest endpoint you have is graph.microsoft.com version 1.0/me. That gets your profile information. If I hit run query, there's my profile data in a JSON object. And that's a public phone number, so I'm not too worried, or email, I'm not too worried about that. So if I go into my app and I try to access this, or if I go to Postman, sorry, and try to access this, so I'll send a GET request to graphmicrosoft.com version 1.0/me, hit send. Hey, you need an access token. So I'll go to authorization and I'll use a bearer token. I have one from earlier, I delete that and grab the bearer token from down here. Super long, but it's there. Paste in my bearer token, hit send, and I have access to the Microsoft Graph. So that's, I went through all this manually on purpose, because now that I've shown you how to do it manually, you'll never have to do it manually again. But I like to show everybody manually what's going on underneath the hood, so that if you ever debugging this, you ever trying to figure out, oh, something went wrong, I don't know what's going on, this error message you're getting doesn't make any sense, being able to pick this apart and do this from scratch is a really important part of understanding how the platform works. So as you saw, I went in, I was able to go get a code, proving I authorized. I was able to take that code, take it to a token endpoint to get a bearer token that's compatible to Microsoft Graph. And then I was able to call the Microsoft Graph using that bearer token, all in Postman. And I promise, now that I show you how to do it manually, I'm going to show you how to do this in .NET. So you probably saw me show this by accident twice now. Visual Studio Code open, blank window, .NET new console. Go create a new console application. And if you haven't ran .NET 6 yet, the new default is a top-level statement. I call them scripts. I know they're not scripts, but top-level statement is the official term, and I don't call it that at all. It's a simple application. If I just clear my screen and .NET run, it'll just say hello world, I believe. It's building. Yeah, it says hello world. Just give it a second. I have a lot of stuff running on my machine. All right. So really simple app, right? Now, I want to do everything we just did, but using .NET. So I can download a library. .NET add package, Microsoft, identity, .client. So it's the Microsoft Identity Platform. MSAL is called Microsoft Identity Client. Going to add that package, and I'm going to build my project. And we're going to jump into Visual Studio Code and write some code. That's what we all came here for, right? All right. Using Microsoft Identity Client. And by the way, you're probably like, where's your using system? All the other stuff. In .NET 6, I have to bring this up because I'm always get that question in chat. Implicit usings allows you to bring in a lot of the normal namespaces that you probably add at the top of your project. Just makes things a little bit faster, makes your code a little bit more relevant. All right, using Microsoft Identity Client. We need our client ID. We've been popping that into Postman a lot, so I should just copy it from Postman. Paste that in. And the Microsoft Identity Client Platform has a public client application builder, static class with a create method. You pass in your client ID, and then it allows you to use a fluent syntax to build up the configuration for this MSAL library. So for instance, we always had a redirect URI, HTTP localhost, and then we have an authority. Now, if we do with authority, there's lots of different options. We can put in HTTPS login.microsoft.online.com/organizations, and that will work just fine. But I don't like the hard code strings if I can avoid it. They have some really cool helper static members, I believe. So Azure Cloud Instance.Azure Public will point us to the public cloud, and then we can either put in a tenant ID, or we can, I believe, if we want to support just showing you we can either put in our tenant ID manually, or there's a AD authority audience and you can say multiple orgs, my org, personal Microsoft accounts, Azure AD and personal Microsoft accounts. I'll say Azure AD, multiple orgs. So this is the same thing as me saying login.microsoftonline.com/organizations. I'm allowing multiple organizations within Azure AD. Gonna pop in a build method, and now I have a client app. Put in a variable called app, and everything's cooking. So this is my client, and I can use it to do cool stuff. So remember, one of the things we do when we're logging in, we need scopes. So I will create a string array, and we're just going to do user.read. Same thing we did in the manual steps. And then we'll say app dot, and this is where we can implement different authentication flows. So you can use integrated Windows authentication. It's really great if you have a domain application that's using domain devices, pretty awesome stuff. Username, password, interactive flow, which we're going to stick to today because it's just a user group meeting. So if I had 6 hours, I'd go through everything, but that's what we're going to do. Silent, if you've already acquired the token in the past, you can call off acquire token silently, and it will just get the token again. So the user is not prompted with pop-ups every single time they want to do anything. And then device code. If you ever have a situation like, for instance, a Raspberry Pi or a server-side application where the only thing you can show is the user some text and they have to authenticate somewhere else in an unintended manner, you use device code. And you've seen that probably before if you use the Azure CLI, where it says, hey, go to this website and put in this device code. Or if you have Netflix, that does the same thing. All right, acquire token interactive, pass it in my scopes, and then .execute async. I'm gonna go ahead and do a little bit of formatting, make this a little easier to read, and we'll await the result of this, and we'll put it in a variable called result. So we asynchronously calling execute after we set up the token, interactive token acquisition. All right, so where's our token? Well, result.access token is that token that we've been talking about all this time. I'll put in a string variable called token, and console.writeLine, print my token out. So if I did everything correctly, this code should just work. I'm going to go check. My browser's still open. Wonderful. Going to go into Windows Terminal, clear my screen, .NET Run. Since I'm doing interactive from a .NET console application, it knows to open my browser. Now, cool thing here, since I did organizations, it goes to the default organizations landing page. I'm going to go ahead and select authentication complete. Feel free to close this browser tab. I jump back and there's my token. Now, I'm going to try something wild because we're on a live user group. I can't remember if I put in my GUID tenant ID here, if it will show my organization's specific branding and login experience. Let's try it. The worst thing I could be is wrong, right? So paste that in and try run this one more time. Clear my screen, .NET Run. All right, worst thing I could be is wrong. Since I put in my tenant ID, it says, okay, I can make inferences about your tenant. It still supports multiple orgs. So if I use another account and type an account with a different organization, it'll redirect to their branding. But because I put in a tenant ID, I'm essentially giving the Microsoft Identity Platform a hint. And it's really great if you have really strong corporate branding and your users, you want them to trust what they're logging into. So if they don't see your corporate branding, they don't trust it, which is a really good user behavior. Anyways, you can use those type of hints to set that up. And click on it. Everything works just the same, just fine. But you didn't come here to see me show you tokens. You came here to see me use this in different places. So we're going to do three things with these here. We are going to manually go to the graph just like we did earlier, just to do an HTTP GET request. We will use the Microsoft Graph SDK, and then I'm going to try and squeeze in the last second demo for us to use Azure Storage and use one of these tokens with Azure Storage. So fingers crossed I can get this done in like 15, 20 minutes. All right, so we're cooking now, right? We are going to just jump in. We have our access token. We don't need to print it out anymore. I'll delete that whole line. And we are going to we're going to go to https graph.microsoft.com version 1.0/me. And that's the me endpoint. And there's a really amazing library called Flurl. I'm pretty sure I'm mispronouncing it. .NET add package Flurl.http that allows me to just call get string async on a string, which is pretty amazing. I far prefer this over HTTP client. All right, so graph.microsoft.com version 1.0/me .get string async. I need to add a using for using Flurl.http. And it says, okay, we need to await this and store the result in a variable called string JSON. All right, so if I run this code, this should fail. Why does it fail? Because there's no actual authentication going on. So let's just prove that out. We'll console writeLine the JSON object, clear .NET Run. Go back to my terminal, call failed will unauthorized. So it's failing as expected. Sounds like a good unit test, right? Well, Fleur also has fluent methods. So we can say with OAuth bearer token and pass in a bearer token. We already have a token. So just pass that in. I know it was great when everything works out, right? Clear my screen, .NET Run. And I think Lee is trying to see if anybody else can ask questions. If anybody wants to unmute and try, he's trying to see if anybody who has attended today can ask a question. He thinks he accidentally muted the entire audience.
Yeah, I think I may have muted the chat. Anyone? All right, I'll keep fiddling with that. Keep going. Sorry to interrupt you.
All right. So jumping back, There's my JSON object with all my profile data. I'm super lazy. I don't want to parse JSON. Let's just jump in and let's create a new class called person. Public. I'm not gonna create a class. I'll create a record. Public record person, string display name, string job title. This is really good if you're creating an instance of something that you're not planning to edit. You kind of want to make it immutable so that if you need a version of this with a change, you need to create a copy of it. It's really, really amazing stuff. So instead of get string async, I'll get JSON async with my person object, person profile, and then I'll print out profile.display name, profile.job title. I'm just having fun right now. I'm just whiffing. Display name, tab, a little string formatting, just because why not? Job title, tab. I might not be tabbed enough, but that's okay. We'll have fun. Save this, just jump in, .NET run. Jump back into the terminal, display name, job title, everything works beautifully. So pretty awesome stuff. Now, this is still pretty manual. If we wanted to bring in a library like the Microsoft Graph SDK, we could do that. So the Microsoft Graph SDK is really .NET add package Microsoft.graph. That's the Microsoft Graph SDK. Now, there's another package that you're going to love. It's called Azure.identity. .NET add package Azure.identity. The Azure.identity package is a series of really cool default identity implementations if you don't want to write out all this MSAL code. Because one of the things I want to do as we keep going through this session is showing you easier and easier ways of doing this. So the Azure.identity library ships with a whole bunch of default implementations of the most common things you want to do. So I'm going to just X out of here, create a new file so I can not lose this code, and I have my program.cs file. I'm going to using Azure.identity, using Microsoft.graph. And essentially what we're creating is a graph client. It's graph service client, I apologize. Graph service client equals new. And then we need to pass in some type of authentication provider. Now, I could write my own authentication provider. We've been doing this all with MSAL all along. The way we do that is we need to create a delegate authentication provider equals new. And in the constructor, we need to pass in a delegate, an asynchronous delegate that can authenticate the request. You can also pass in a synchronous one as long as you return a task at the end. So authenticate. So request async delegate handler. And you're wondering where I'll get these class names from. Every time I go to one of these, I'm looking at the names of the what's required for the constructor. This has a single input. And within this request, we can tell it what we want to do. So for example, let's add back in our code here for fun. Get our access token. And so anytime our Azure SDK needs to make an API request, we're going to take that request, headers.authorization equals new authentication header value, add a system.net HTTP headers. It's a bearer token with our token. Return task.completed task. So let me walk through what just happened here. We have a delegate. Anytime we're making a request to one of the Azure SDKs, whether it's the Graph SDK or maybe the Azure Storage SDK, it's going to intercept that request and inject our access token as the bearer token for authorization header. So we'll pass in that delegate to our delegate authentication provider, and we'll pass in that provider to our Graph Service client. Now we could just use the Graph Service client. So client.me will issue a request to client.me where we get my profile asynchronously. It will await that and returns a user object. So it already has its own strongly defined types and objects. We can go in and print out like user.display name, user.job title. Just really, really simple stuff. And I'm just showing this example because I want to get to the Azure Storage example. .NET Run, all the same things we're doing. Oh, I forgot my using blocks. Using Microsoft identity.client, and I'm trying to remember if I needed another one. I don't need Floral. All right. .NET build. Let me just build, make sure everything works. I forgot a namespace. Apologize about that. .NET Run. So once the Graph SDK says I need authentication, it walked us through the whole MSAL thing. So I just showed you the most complex way to use Azure Identity. But Azure Identity ships with stuff where we can delete all of this code if we wanted to. Let me show you what that looks like. And this is we're about to have a lot of fun here. So I'm going to get rid of everything except my Graph Service Client. And remember, we have to pass in something to Graph Service Client to authenticate. Now, one of the cool things about the Azure Identity Library, and if you can find this if you go to NuGet.org and search for Azure.identity, it's all sorts of documentation stuff here, the README. It tells you that there's so many different ways you can use Azure Identity Library. It allows you to integrate in with your dev stack. So especially if you're injecting dependencies in dev, you can say, you know what, just use the Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell, or Visual Studio Code, or Visual Studio authentication. So I'll say that one more time. You can authenticate using environment variables, Visual Studio Code, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell with this Azure Identity Library. So in dev, if I just want to play around with the Graph client, I could just jump in and say, you know what, Azure CLI credential equals new, and pass in that credential to my Graph Service Client. And now whatever I'm signed into the Azure CLI as is the identity is going to be used here. And for fun, all underneath the hood, all of this is used at MSAL. I'm just showing you, like, I like to show the mechanics before we show the easy way to do it, right? Let's go play around with this. So AZ login, assign it to my account. We're logged in. I have so many subscriptions, so I'll just set one. I'll clear my screen real fast, right? You see account set subscription. I'm using LRN subscription today, so that's the one we're going to use. And if I did this correctly, I should just be able to .NET Run. I don't have to do any interactive authentication because I'm already logged into the Azure CLI. If I go easy log out, you see everything worked. And I try .NET Run again, it's going to fail because the Azure CLI is not logged in. Again, really cool stuff. I just did it for Azure CLI. There's a version for Visual Studio, Azure PowerShell. There's a Visual Studio Code credential. And this requires you to have the Azure extension of Visual Studio Code. And whatever you're logged as here will be used. So .NET Run. Well, I don't know if I saved it. I think I did. Yeah, there we go. And then if I log out Azure sign out, log out an extension, this should now fail. So really cool, like in dev, if I don't want to even bother implementing MSAL code really early in the project, I'm still authenticating Azure services, still figuring things out. I can use these helper classes. They also have, this is the one that gives me a lot of heartburn, the default Azure credential. If I see this in code review, I'm not going to be very happy. The default Azure credential tries a sequence of different types of credentials until it finds one it's happy with. I hate that because you just never know which, especially on dev device, what you're logged into and what you're not logged into is. So I think it tries environment variables, then it tries Visual Studio, then it tries Visual Studio Code, then it tries Azure CLI, then it tries Azure PowerShell. And I may have the order wrong here, but it tries like a lot of different things. It's really great if you're logged into everything as one identity. If you're me and I have like 6 different test accounts, this is the bane of my existence. So please don't use that. Use the actual more specific ones when you're writing your own code. I promised a good time. So I'm going to sign back into the Visual Studio Code. We're going to make sure everything still works. Save it. I'm going to .NET Run. And for my last demo, this is my favorite magic act today. I am going to create an Azure storage account. I'm going to use role-based access control in Azure AD to set up my application registration to have permission to access Azure storage using use my delegated account, and then my account's gonna have permission to contribute data to Azure storage. And if I get everything right and the moon is in the right position, this will all work, right? All right, we're gonna roll the dice here because normally I would have stopped by now, but this is one really fun thing I like to show because this is where it gets real. And by the way I'm showing you how to do this is a standard for the Azure SDK for .NET. So it's not specific to Azure Storage. Once you learn how to do this one Azure service, any service that implements the Azure SDK for .NET implements the same Azure identity pattern. All right, we're gonna create a storage account. Hit create. I'm gonna create a resource group called demo. Fun demo. Give it a fun name. Fun demo. Hit OK. Give it a nonsense name. Hopefully it's not too long. Locally redundant because I'm cheap. Hit review create and create my new Azure storage account. Now this is where I'm going to have a lot of fun. Once I create the Azure storage account, I'm going to use role-based access control to give myself permission to contribute data to that account. While I'm waiting for that, I can go to my Azure AD application registration. Remember we clicked on API permissions? Here I can add a new permission. So hit add permission. And I could choose different Azure services. I'm going to scroll down to Azure Storage, and I'm going to say delegated permission, user impersonation. This allows me to log in and for to use this Azure Storage account. Now I need to set up admin consent. So I'm going to grant admin consent for my directory. Hit yes, and we are good to go. That part's baked. Now my storage account is deployed. It's just a regular storage account, nothing crazy here. I'm going to go to access control, and I can see that there's all sorts of stuff here. If I click role assignments, there aren't any role assignments yet. Now, don't assume because you have owner access to a resource that you can actually do stuff from an API perspective. Many of the services have very specific roles that you have to assign yourself to before you can access them using something like this. So I'll show you an example for Azure Storage. Hit add role assignment. There's the owner, contributor, reader roles. You've seen those before. If we scroll all the way down, I have a storage blob data owner, storage blob data reader, and storage blob data contributor. I'm going to select storage blob data contributor. This allows me to read, write, and delete containers and data in the storage account. Hit next. And it says, okay, who do I want to assign this role to? I'm going to go to select members, and I'll just assign it to myself. So Sidney is C#run.net, hit select, hit review and assign, and I've now created a role assignment. Now I have the storage blob data contributor role, so I should be able to add stuff to the storage account. So everything's baked in. I'm going to go back to the Windows terminal, .NET add package, azure.storage.blobs, and just clear my screen, and then I'm going to go into here, and instead of Microsoft Graph and delete all that, I'm going to use azure.storage.blobs. Now we're still using a Visual Studio credential, or Visual Studio Code credential, excuse me. It's just Visual Studio credential if you're using Visual Studio. All right, so from here, I should be able to say blob service client equals new, and blob service client wants a URI and then a token credential. So let's create a URI for my blob endpoint. And I forget, yeah, new is C#, you don't have to repeat the type after new anymore. Let's just jump in, get my endpoint information for the storage account. So I'm just gonna go down to settings and select endpoints. And there's my blob service endpoint. That's the URI. I'm gonna go ahead and paste this in my code. And then when I create the blob service client, I'll put in my endpoint and I'll say use the Visual Studio Code credential. So client.get blob container client, because I have a service client, I'm going to get a container client. This storage account, if I go back and look, doesn't have any containers. So I'll create a container called, well, it has a logs, but I'll create a container called cap area. we have our container client. I'll just put in a variable called container. Container.create if not exists AC, and await that. That's it. That's all the code I'm going to write. We're going to use the built-in Visual Studio Code credential. As you saw earlier, we can use Azure CLI credentials. We can build our own authentication provider and show you all 3 different ways to do this. But I just wanted to, this is where I really want to tie it in for you to see that this is not just for the Microsoft Graph. You can do this for any Azure service that's available via Azure AD authentication. So I do this. I have applications where we use Azure AD authentication end-to-end to communicate between Cosmos DB, storage, SQL, Microsoft, Azure Cognitive Services, Azure Cognitive Search, all sorts of cool stuff that we can do, all using the same libraries. And I only have to write my code once using Azure Identity. In dev, we just use one of these credential libraries. In production, we either use an MSAL implementation that's already provided, or we write our own. As long as we implement that authentication provider, we're good to go. All right, so from here, everything's saved. .NET run. I didn't print anything out, so it should just run and not throw any errors. There we go. If I go back to my storage account, refresh, there's our cap area container. So I just use my Azure Identity to store the Visual Studio Code to interact with the Azure Storage SDK. No connection strings, any of that type of stuff. We're using Azure AD off. If I revoke my access here from the role assignment, then this identity won't work anymore. I don't know how fast that is, so let's just try it. I don't think it's instant, but we'll see. We'll create a new container called thanks everyone, .NET run. Yeah, there's a little bit of latency between where you remove that role-based access control permission and when it happens, but eventually what it'll do is it'll throw an error message. Now, I show you all the technical demos. One last thing I wanted to show you is I shared a link at the beginning of this user group to youtube.com/ I gotta spell correctly, Microsoft Dev Radio. Been doing a lot of really cool sessions with Microsoft Dev Radio. If you go to playlists, you'll see all the different webinar sessions we've been doing. And we have a JavaScript and a .NET version of a webinar series that we did where we went for 4 or 5 hours on this specific topic. The demos I showed you just a taste. We had a whole hour session dedicated solely to just integrating with Azure services where we use SQL, where we use storage, where we use cognitive Azure cognitive services to integrate with AI services. So it's pretty cool where you can write one application, authentication code once, and then integrate across the spectrum. There are lots of other workshops here, but my recommendation is if you're really interested in this, dive into our webinar series. Really take a look at it. And then if you're doing JavaScript on your client side, you can definitely look at the JavaScript flavor of this webinar series because the MSAL, remember, MSAL is just on top of the same endpoint, whether you use .NET or JavaScript. So you can totally write MSAL.js code on the front end and MSAL.NET code on the back end and use Microsoft Identity Platform as your one true source of authorization across your entire application. So really exciting stuff. I want to thank everybody for having me here today. As you can tell, I'm pretty excited about this. I'll hang around a couple minutes if anybody have questions, but other than that, I pretty much gave you a whole bunch of homework to do and to dig into and to frustrate your teammates with. So, I'm always around. If you're running into problems with this, we have msusdev@microsoft.com. Normally, I would give my email, but we actually created an inbox where people have been asking us questions about the identity platform. And if you send an email here, essentially we'll try to answer for you. Usually it comes to me. If it's not me, we'll send it out to somebody else. So again, thanks everybody for having me, and hopefully I'll come back someday and talk about some of the other topics that we're here doing some really cool webinars about.